and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our program, the historical currents that led to President Trump's rise to power. I'll talk with a co-author of the new book, One Nation After Trump. Plus, week one of a closely watched murder trial at the center of a national debate over so-called sanctuary cities and immigration. A look at the key developments in the Kathryn Steinle case. But first, it's been more than 3 weeks since 4 fires broke out in the NorthBay, killing dozens of people, destroying thousands of structures and devastating neighborhoods. Many residents in the affected areas are now looking ahead. Should they leave or rebuild? And what will it take to start over? We'll start with an update from James Lee Witt, the interim executive director of Rebuild NorthBay, a nonprofit organization coordinating recovery efforts after the wildfires. He also served as the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, under President Bill Clinton. He joins us via Skype now from Little Rock, Arkansas. Mr. Witt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
What is the most urgent need right now in the fire-ravaged parts of Sonoma and Napa counties?
Most important thing now is for EPA to get the hazardous material out of the way, where then the Corps of Engineers and the contractors can come in and get the debris out of the way, but also start planning for what your neighborhoods want to look like and meeting with developers and seeing how you want to rebuild. And I just stress that as you are thinking about rebuilding, think about how you're going to build back better, safer, with more resiliency, and that's going to be really important.
And that rebuilding process is challenging. If you take stock of the city's housing stock, for example, in Santa Rosa alone, roughly 5% of that city's housing stock, nearly 3,000 homes were destroyed by the fires. So what can be done to address that problem, the housing shortage problem, during the rebuilding process?
We did have a discussion with that, and FEMA provides temporary housing for individuals, which they're doing now in hotels and motels, but that it can only last so long. And we talked about what kind of temporary housing could be put in place, whether it's modular housing in areas that could be set up. And then also we discussed about the long-term recovery efforts. So that it's really, really important to be able to put a temporary housing program in place so you can keep people there and you keep the workers there and start building back the revenue within those communities.
What kinds of disaster aid can fire victims get from FEMA?
Well, of course, they have several different programs. Of course, FEMA's individual assistance program, as well as the individual family grant program. And then you also have the HUD housing program, as well as SBA. And SBA can do home loans as well as small business loans. And SBA can, particularly the small business, and has a loan on that small business, SBA can come in and rework that loan and then loan them money to build their business back at a low interest. One of the things they've asked me to do is to work with FEMA and Cal OES and to make sure that we maximize all the different federal, state funding streams and then identify the void that's going to be there, and there will be voids. And the nonprofit help fill those voids to help people get back on their feet.
And since you're working with FEMA, Mr. Witt, there have been reports that some undocumented immigrants are afraid to seek federal aid out of fear that they'll be reported to immigration authorities. In fact, on Thursday, 5 California congressmen wrote a letter requesting confirmation that FEMA will not disclose the immigration status of fire victims. What is FEMA's process for how immigration status information is handled?
I'm not sure what their status or what their policy is today. I know at one time in California when we had a big freeze that froze oranges and crops, we housed immigrant workers at that time, and we did not have any problems and did not have any reporting of any illegals.
Will you be taking up this issue with them, though, when you're working with FEMA?
Absolutely.
Why did you decide to step in and take charge of Rebuild NorthBay?
When I was director of FEMA under President Clinton for 8 years, we had 350 presidential disaster declarations. And, it just breaks my heart to see one family or 1,000 families lose everything they worked all their life for. And so, and over the years as a director of FEMA and my company in the private sector, when we responded to so many disasters, I just want to make a difference, and I want to make a difference and help them to help themselves and to get their life back together and as soon as possible. And that's why I still do this.
All right, James Lee Witt, the interim director of Rebuild NorthBay, thank you so much for joining us from Little Rock, Arkansas.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too. And now to broaden the discussion, I'm joined by Santa Rosa Press Democrat editorial director Paul Gullixson. He joins us via Skype from Santa Rosa. And here in our studio, KQED News reporter Farida Jhabvala Romero. Welcome to you both. Farida, we just heard James Lee Witt, the new head of Rebuild NorthBay, talk about the issue of whether FEMA will ask undocumented immigrants about their immigration status. What are you hearing in the community about the fears among undocumented immigrants on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a concern, not only among undocumented residents who lost homes or jobs, but among their relatives who are U.S. citizens and who can apply for that aid.
Paul, you wrote a very impassioned, touching op-ed asking fire victims to please stay, don't leave the region. Was there a key moment or interaction that led you to write that op-ed?
Really, it was the result of a number of conversations I've had with many friends who are victims of this fire. This obviously is a very personal event for the staff here at the Press Democrat. We know dozens, if not hundreds of friends, family members who have lost homes, and many of them are having challenges, a great deal of difficulty trying to find a new place to live. And many of them are ending up in places as far away as Novato and Windsor, which is quite a drive. And we also are aware that after a catastrophe of this type, areas tend to lose population. New Orleans lost some 20% of its population after Hurricane Katrina. And we already had a significant housing crisis in our area, and now this is only going to compound that all the worse. So there is concern that we're going to lose our doctors, teachers, police officers, even firefighters have lost homes, and it's going to be very difficult for them. It already is, and finding a new place to live. We have over 200 doctors in our area who have lost their homes. And we already have a doctor shortage, and some of these physicians are not going to have any difficulty being offered positions in other areas that may be more easier for housing, and that's going to be, and so there is real concern there that eventually, after this wears off, that they may seek other opportunities.
Yeah. Well, and Farida, I want to bring you in because I know you've been to the fire-ravaged regions and areas. And what are some of the biggest everyday challenges that fire victims are facing as they try to pull their lives back together? People still have jobs. Their children still have to go to school.
Yeah, well, like Paul mentioned, housing is #1 issue right now in a lot of people's minds who lost their homes. I mean, like he was saying, there was already a really tight, rental market in the Santa Rosa area. And so people are trying to figure out where they're going to live in the long term while they rebuild their homes, or where are they going to be able to rent. I was able to speak with students at Santa Rosa Junior College who lost homes. And for them, it's not only that, impact of the fires, but also now that they're back at school and with classes, they don't have textbooks, they don't have computers, they don't have laptops.
And how many students lost their homes at that college?
Yeah, well, the college is reporting that at least 600 students lost homes, as well as dozens of faculty and students. So a lot of people in this situation.
And Paul, can you put this into the broader Bay Area context for us? I mean, Santa Rosa was one of the most affordable places, or more affordable places in the Bay Area, where people could live and commute to jobs in other cities throughout the region. What's the impact on the Bay Area as a whole? There aren't too many places anymore, sadly, where you can get a home for the median price of $500,000. Well,
I think that's the big question. I mean, my wife and I are from the South Bay, from Palo Alto and Los Altos, and we came up here 20 years ago. It wasn't a more affordable opportunity for us to live here, and the question will be where can people go? Now, some people up in Fountain Grove, some of our doctors, they'll have the resources to relocate to other places in the Bay Area if they choose. I obviously don't want them to do that, but they may seek those opportunities. Others may end up moving to Lake County, of all places, which also had a significant fire in the Valley Fire 2 years ago. We're already seeing more of our workers come from that area. And this fire just really hit a broad spectrum of our population, from the very wealthiest to some of the very poorest. And Coffee Park, for example, is a very blue-collar area. Many of those people are lifelong residents of Santa Rosa, and it's going to be tough.
Certainly a broad economic impact. And Farida, we only have about a minute or so. What is the long-term economic impact? Many businesses and wineries were not damaged, but they've seen a dramatic drop in visitors. I've had friends email me saying that the tasting rooms, several of them have had to close.
Yeah, well, I mean, local authorities are expecting an economic downturn because of the fires, and you have to remember the Sonoma County was having an economy that was booming before the fires. So they had record, hotel occupancy rates and a lot of records in terms of economic growth. And so this is definitely going to be a downturn for them. But the county also says that as soon as the fires are completely over, they were already planning to start a big campaign to try to attract visitors again to wineries. Because the wine industry, agriculture, as well as tourism and retail are about a third of the economy in the county, so a big part of it.
Paul, what's your biggest concern now as the rebuilding phase begins?
Well, I think we already had a shortage of doctors and nurses and teachers, and I think the other shortage we had was construction workers. I think the concern is, where are these people going to come from who's going to help us rebuild? These are 6,800 homes we've lost, almost twice as many as were lost in the Oakland Hills fire. This is going to take a huge amount of work, and his concern is, where are the people going to come from who can help us pound the nails and get this done quickly?
All right. Well, our thoughts are certainly with all of you folks up there. Paul Gullixson with the Santa Rosa Press Democrat, and Farida Jhabvala Romero with KQED. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To politics now. Donald Trump's presidency has led to national soul-searching, even as his base continues to support him. This week, Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona announced he would not seek re-election next year, saying he cannot be complicit in the face of Trump's, quote, reckless, outrageous, and undignified behavior. Fellow GOP Senator Bob Corker has also criticized the president and announced last month he won't seek re-election. How Trump came to power and the GOP's role in his rise are the focus of a new book, One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. Joining me now is Thomas Mann, one of the book's 3 co-authors. He's also a resident scholar at UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. Nice to have you here.
Delighted to be with you.
In your book, you make the case that President Trump is less of an outlier than he may seem. Can you explain that?
What we mean is he's less of an outlier to the Republican Party. He managed to seemingly come out of nowhere and win the nomination from all of the regular Republicans. He did that because there was a market for his kind of populism, nationalism, nativism that had been brewing for years, if not decades, in the Republican Party.
And you compared it to sort of a Jurassic Park, in that the Republican Party created the conditions for this, for someone like Donald Trump, and then lost control of their creation. So when did the radicalization of the Republican Party begin?
It probably goes all the way back to the 60s with the civil rights movement, the countercultural politics of the Democratic Party. But by the time Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, the coalition was clear. It was the conservative evangelicals, it was the business community, and it was white working class Americans who were really distraught by the kind of changes that were occurring in the economy and frankly, by developments of the diversification of the population.
And you wrote that you felt the one key turning point was Newt Gingrich and his rise to power.
Newt was incredible. He came in as a new member of Congress in 1979 with a well-developed plan to so criticize and delegitimize the Congress as an institution that the Republicans would throw out the long-term Democratic majority and usher the Republicans into power. he had a special vocabulary that he taught new Republican candidates that he recruited for office. He said, your job is not to explain the policy choices to Americans and help deliberate. Your job is to attack. It's to demonize your opponents.
So fast forward now to 2017. We have a situation in the past 2 weeks where at least 4 notable Republicans have been sounding the alarm against President Trump. We have former President George W. Bush, Senators John McCain, Bob Corker, and Jeff Flake have all delivered really harsh critiques of the president, the Republican Party, the direction of the country. What effect do you think this will have?
Trump has become a real threat. He's has authoritarian instincts. He's an ethno-nationalist, and he's broken virtually every norm in American government. And yet, the Republicans made a Faustian bargain with Trump. We'll put up with your peculiar and even anti-democratic behavior if you sign our legislation. With a unified Republican government, we can get our tax bill, we can repeal and replace Obamacare, and we can get rid of all of this regulation of business. That was the deal, but it's not been going so well.
You and the book's 2 other co-authors, E.J. Dionne and Norman Ornstein, I know that you consider yourselves nonpartisan, but you are also widely considered to be to the left of center. So does the Democratic Party here bear some of the blame for the rise of Donald Trump, especially among white working class voters who felt abandoned by the Democratic Party that once championed them?
Sure. Democrats are not angels. We're not here to make the case for the Democratic Party more broadly. This is a development in our politics that happened gradually over time as people's identities became more important than their thoughts about public policy issues. And the 2 coalitions departed. Democrats, believing in government, were prepared to bargain, negotiate. They played hardball. But Republicans, wanting limited government and lower taxes, were more inclined to try to seed the public with complete distrust of government. So the reality is both parties were implicated, but the Republicans Party was the only place where a person like Donald Trump could actually garner a major party nomination for the presidency.
And on a broader platform, you claim in the book that our entire democracy is in crisis, the way that our political system is set up. Can you detail that?
Well, we have now such polarized, tribalized political parties that the main incentive the public has is voting against the other side. And therefore, it's very difficult for a member of one party to do business with a member of the other party in Congress or with the president.
So then what's the antidote for all the challenges you pointed out?
If Trump is a product of our democracy's weaknesses and a threat to it further, the antidote is citizen activism. It's you and me and millions of others that take seriously the threats to our democracy and get active. That doesn't mean 135 million people are going to make politics their major activity, but millions more Americans have joined up locally, in states and around the country. All kinds of people trying sort of very hard to reestablish the norms of American democracy and not let us drift into the autocracy we see happening all across the world.
And so your book ends on that optimistic note. Dr. Thomas Mann, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
In July 2015, 32-year-old Kate Steinle was shot and killed at Pier 14 in San Francisco. This week, opening arguments began in the trial of her alleged killer, Jose Garcia Inez Zarate, an undocumented Mexican immigrant who had been deported multiple times. The case has been cited by immigration hardliners, including President Trump, to boost support for a border wall and punish so-called sanctuary cities. Garcia Zarate's attorney claims that his client had accidentally fired the gun that killed Steinle after finding the weapon on the ground. Joining me now with a closer look at the case are KQED reporters Alex Emsley and also Marisa Lagos. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Alex, this was week one of the trial. You've been in the courtroom. What were some of the key moments? Take us through that.
I think probably the most emotional testimony so far came from Kathryn Steinle's father, James Steinle, which in relatively brief testimony, he was not cross-examined, but just took the jury and myself in the gallery through this walk that he was taking on Pier 14 with his daughter when she suddenly fell and reached out for him, asking for his help. Those were the last words he heard from her because she died later that day at the hospital. And
what is the prosecutor's main argument and what is the defense attorney's main argument?
I think this is a bit of a unique and interesting murder trial because it all hinges just on intent. It's not in dispute that Garcia Zarate was on that pier and that the shot that killed Kathryn Steinle originated from his hands. The prosecution is saying that he intended to shoot someone. Potentially Kathryn Steinle, and that justifies a murder conviction. The defense is saying he picked up an object that was wrapped in cloth. He didn't know what it was, and it went off. It was an accidental shooting.
And Marisa, this case became a signature issue for Donald Trump as he was campaigning for president. How has it affected the national debate over sanctuary cities and immigration?
Yeah, I mean, this case was really seized on by Donald Trump and others on the right, particularly, who, already kind of had it out for policies like San Francisco's, in which they bar local law enforcement from, in most cases, cooperating with immigration and customs. And so, Donald Trump talked about it repeatedly on the campaign trail. He invoked Kathryn Steinle's name at the convention last summer, in his main immigration speech that he made shortly before the election. And it really has become this rallying cry, although I'm not sure it's the best case. There's a lot of sort of complicating factors here, including the fact that the federal government had him in their possession just before they sent him to San Francisco. And so, it does keep getting brought up, but a lot of times the facts of the actual case and the background of it are misstated by people who are using this as evidence that this is not the way that cities should operate.
And in fact, Garcia Zarate has a felony record because he had repeatedly been caught crossing the border over a period of 2 decades. So even if he had been deported in this case, would it have made a difference?
I mean, what if anything had happened, right? What if he hadn't found that gun or didn't have that gun? I mean, who knows? But I do think that if you look at his history, he had a couple of felony drug charges from the early 90s. But then, yes, he spent between 1998 and 2015 a total of 15 years in federal prisons for illegal reentry. And after 2 of those stints, the federal government just deported him back to Mexico. In this case, they didn't. They chose to send him to San Francisco on a 20-year-old marijuana charge. And so, yes, if they had deported him at that point, maybe Kathryn Steinle would still be alive. And if San Francisco hadn't chosen to come pick him up on this 20-year-old charge that was then almost immediately dismissed, who knows what would have happened. But it is sort of an interesting question because I think there's a lot of moments that, if one thing had changed from a lot of people's perspective, things would be very different.
When this case gets to the national level, it continues to get simplified and you miss these details. One of the biggest ones that I have never heard President Trump talk about or anyone who kind of politically opines about this case is the fact that the gunshot that killed Kathryn Steinle was a ricochet. It ricocheted approximately 12 feet from Garcia Zarate, traveled another 78 feet before it hit Kathryn Steinle. The defense is saying there has never been a ricochet shot charged as a murder in San Francisco up until this case.
And people talk about him like a violent felon. He didn't have any violent felonies. People act as if I just think that she was shot point blank by him, that this is an open and shut case. So there's a lot of misinformation out there.
And we keep on hearing immigration every time this is mentioned in the national headlines, but will jurors actually hear evidence about Garcia Zarate's immigration status?
No, I don't think so. I believe that that's all excluded and the parties have agreed to that with the one exception of when jury selection was going on, jurors were asked, if they had strong feelings about sanctuary cities or immigration policies in general. But then we're told in no uncertain terms that that would not be considered in this case. This case is about intent and whether or not Garcia Zarate is guilty of murder.
And Alex, you brought up the gun that was stolen from the Bureau of Land Management ranger, and the ranger was actually on the stand this week. Are there any clear explanations of how that happened, how the gun got taken from him?
It took a while, but yes, that narrative has become somewhat more clear. This ranger is based on the far southern California border with Mexico, a place called El Centro. He traveled on June 27th, some over 600 miles to San Francisco with his family in his personal vehicle, but on his way to an official assignment in Montana. And he stopped in San Francisco sometime late in the evening, around 9:30 p.m. They stopped for dinner.
And he left it in a backpack, right, in his car, which was broken into? This
was his backup weapon, and it wasn't a backpack in his car that was broken into. One of the interesting things that he said on the stand is this was common practice for him. He usually had that backpack with him for the protection of his family.
And so why does it matter where the gun came from in this case?
I think generally when you're looking at a murder case or really any homicide, the origin of the weapon is of interest. And especially with the defense's argument of he found it seconds before it went off and this was an accidental discharge. Also, there's a civil case that is held up right now as the criminal case plays out. Yeah. But the Kathryn Steinle's family is suing the U.S. government for negligence on the part of the Bureau of Land Management.
And Marisa, we just have a little bit of time remaining, but can you bring us up to date on the status of Kate's Law? This was something that the House passed in response to the Kate Steinle case. It would essentially increase penalties for those who try to re-enter the country illegally. Where does that stand now? It's in the Senate. It hasn't come up for a vote. It's not clear whether they have the votes. But I will say, it's sort of ironic that that's where this has gone politically, because experts I've talked to do not think that that law would have saved Kathryn Steinle, but perhaps if this gun hadn't been stolen, she might still be alive. All right, Marisa Lagos and Alex Emsley of KQED, thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us. For more of our coverage, go to kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.